Bill Gaither has spent 6 decades building something that outlasted every trend in Christian music. And at 90 years old, the things he has carried quietly are starting to surface in the pauses between his words. Gospel music has given him a long, well-documented life, and the Gaither Vocal Band has cycled through some of the most gifted voices the Southern gospel tradition has ever produced. But one chapter of that band's history comes back to him differently from the rest. Not with bitterness, not with the clean resolution that devotional storytelling usually reaches for, but with a specific kind of weight that the people who have sat in the same rooms with him recognize immediately. What that weight actually contains is where this story begins, and what it reveals about the distance between a person's gift and their readiness to carry what comes with it is the part nobody with a real platform has been willing to say clearly until now. Born in Alexandria, Indiana in 1936, Bill Gaither wrote the songs that became the soundtrack of faith for multiple generations of believers. He touched me because he lives. The King is coming. Hymns sung in church sanctuaries and at kitchen tables and at the bedsides of people who needed something to hold on to in the dark. The Gaither Vocal Band came together in its first form in the early 1980s, a vehicle for Bill's harmonies and songwriting that grew into something far larger than anyone had planned. And then, in 1991, he launched the Homecoming Gatherings, a reunion of older gospel voices initially captured on video almost by accident. And that first recording became a phenomenon that nobody in Southern gospel had anticipated. For millions of fans who discovered those recordings through the 1990s and early 2000s, the Homecoming wasn't simply a concert series. It was something closer to community. And the voices on those recordings were part of the spiritual furniture of people's actual lives. The Gaither Vocal Band has carried some of the most distinctive vocal instruments in contemporary Christian music. David Phelps brought a tenor of operatic range that stopped rooms cold the first time audiences heard it. Guy Penrod carried a rougher, warmer edge that connected with listeners raised on country gospel, a directness that didn't require distance between the song and the singer. Wes Hampton brought a steadiness that anchored the harmonies without pulling attention from the lyric. Mark Lowry brought something harder to categorize, a comedian's gift for the truth, a willingness to ask the questions that devotional music usually leaves politely unasked, an honesty that made people laugh and cry in the same breath, and then wonder afterward how both things had happened at once. And then Michael English joined the Gaither Vocal Band in the late 1980s, and the whole center of gravity shifted. Michael's voice was one of those genuinely rare instruments, a tenor with an effortless upper range and an emotional directness that made other singers pay attention the moment he opened his mouth. Bill Gaither recognized it immediately, and he did what Bill does with gifts he recognizes. He gave Michael every resource the organization had. By 1994, Michael English stood at the top of the Gospel Music Association's annual rankings, holding the Artist of the Year award, the highest individual honor in the industry. That ascent had taken less than a decade, which tells you everything about the velocity of what Bill had set in motion. The Homecoming Gatherings were drawing together the legends of Southern gospel alongside newer voices, and Michael's presence gave those recordings a contemporary energy that reached audiences who might otherwise never have found their way to that music at all. From every external angle, the story looked like what success is supposed to look like. A gift recognized early and given room to become what it was always going to be. But what Bill Gaither has said in the years since, in interviews where his voice drops slightly when Michael's name enters the conversation, carries a grief alongside the gratitude that rewards careful attention. Not the grief of disappointment in another person's talent, but a different kind. The kind that belongs to someone who gave everything he had and watched it go sideways in a way he didn't see coming. Michael English resigned from the Gaither organization in 1994. The same year, he collected the Artist of the Year award, and the departure had nothing to do with musical direction or creative differences. An extramarital affair had become public, and Michael stepped away from the ministry rather than let the story consume it from the inside. What followed were years that nobody connected to this story has described as anything other than difficult. Reports of substance abuse, extended periods where Michael disappeared from gospel music almost entirely, a personal life that came apart at exactly the moment his professional life should have been opening into something even larger. Bill Gaither never publicly condemned Michael English, and that fact carries more weight than it might appear to on the surface. Condemnation was never the language of the homecoming world, and it wasn't the theology Bill and Gloria had built their life's work around. But those who have followed this story across decades know that a difference exists between the warmth in Bill's voice when he discusses singers who left on their own terms, and the particular quietness that arrives when he discusses the circumstances surrounding certain other departures. That quietness held for 30 years, and what it contained is where this story turns into something nobody in his immediate circle was prepared to address publicly. When Michael English eventually returned to gospel music, his reconciliation with the Gaither organization was not a quiet or administrative matter. It was documented and visible, and for the fans who had loved his voice and grieved what happened to him, it carried an emotional charge that few moments in the entire homecoming history have matched. Bill Gaither extended that welcome publicly and without apparent reservation. Michael recorded again, performed again on the homecoming stages, and found his way back to the music that had defined the best years of his earlier life. None of that welcome was performance, and anyone who has watched Bill Gaither discuss Michael English across the span of recorded interviews understands that the affection running through those conversations is genuine. The grief is genuine, and the two have always existed together, not in resolution, but in the complicated way that real relationships between real people actually hold together across the long distance of difficult years. What Bill has reflected on, and this is the piece that the Dove Award coverage and the Gospel Music Association retrospectives have consistently left out, is the structural question living underneath the personal one. The Gaither Vocal Band at its strongest was carrying more weight than a musical act typically carries. People brought their hardest seasons to those recordings. They played "I Bowed on My Knees and Cried Holy" at funerals, and listened to "Satisfied" in hospital waiting rooms in the middle of personal losses that required something more substantial than comfort. The voices on those recordings weren't separate from the faith those voices were supposed to represent. For a substantial portion of the audience, they were the same thing, and that sameness was precisely the point. When someone at the center of that kind of ministry breaks in a visible and public way, the fracture doesn't stay personal. It moves outward into all the living rooms and car trips and bedside moments where a particular song had come to mean something specific. Bill Gaither said, in a moment captured in a longer interview that received far less attention than it deserved, that you wonder when something like that happens, whether you gave someone a platform before they were ready for it. Those words weren't accusation. They arrived as the reflection of a man who had spent years asking what part, if any, his own judgment had played in what followed, and who found, after 30 years of sitting with the question, that it didn't fully resolve. Gloria Gaither has written about the distance that can exist between a person's gifting and their character, and the way that distance becomes its own kind of trouble when the gift is placed in front of a large audience before the character has had time to catch up. Mark Lowry, who has always been the member of the Gaither family most willing to speak plainly about the things that cost something, acknowledged in separate interviews that Michael's departure left a wound across the entire organization, one that didn't follow any clean narrative of fault or innocence, but settled instead into the complicated middle territory that real human failure always occupies. And Michael English's situation wasn't the only time Bill Gaither had to hold together the tension between extraordinary talent and the private struggle that extraordinary talent sometimes runs alongside. Russ Taff's battle with alcoholism became eventually one of the most honest testimonies in all of contemporary Christian music. His voice in those homecoming recordings was the kind of sound that audiences responded to at a level below conscious preference, that unmistakable roughness at the top of his range, the way he carried a lyric as though the song were pulling something physical out of him. When Russ's story became visible through the documentary I Still Believe, which captured both the beauty of what he had built and the damage that alcohol had done to his family across those same years, the gospel community had to sit with something that wasn't comfortable. The homecoming cameras had been in the room. The man singing about faith surviving hardship had been living a version of that hardship that the liner notes never mentioned. Bill Gaither kept Russ Taff inside the homecoming world through those years, and depending on who you ask, that decision reflects either the deep, unconditional love at the center of the Gaither theology, or the complicated question of what genuine support looks like when someone you love isn't yet ready to receive it. The honest answer is probably that it reflects both, held together without resolution, the way most real decisions made out of love tend to be held. What the handling of both Michael English and Russ Taff reveals across the full span of those recordings is a consistent conviction on Bill Gaither's part that restoration is always available, that the platform should be there when the person is ready to return to it, that the relationship between the organization and the artist doesn't end because one chapter ends badly. Gospel music as a tradition has always been more honest about human failure than most other forms. The songs themselves are built around it, the prodigal coming home, the wanderer finding the road back, the one who had nothing left discovering that grace had been there all along. Michael English's story belongs inside that tradition, not as a cautionary tale, but as a genuinely human one. And so, in his quieter way, does Bill Gaither's, not as a man who failed, but as one who loved a young singer enough to give him everything, and who has spent the years since sorting through what that love set in motion, without the comfort of a clean answer to land on. The platform and the person have to grow at the same rate, and when they don't, the platform doesn't simply stop growing. It becomes a weight the person wasn't built to carry yet, and the person who placed them under that weight carries something of his own. 30 years of reflection have produced for a man now in his 80s not regret in the simple sense, but something more honest than regret. A reckoning with the gap between what you can see in a person's gift and what you cannot yet see in their readiness, and the slow understanding that those two things are not the same, and that mistaking one for the other has consequences that extend far beyond the two people sitting in the room when the decision gets made. Bill Gaither's story isn't finished, and neither is the conversation he started, whether he intended to or not. Every time he pauses just slightly too long before answering a particular question about a particular name, the weight of 30 years is still there, still unresolved, and still the most honest thing about everything he built.